Okay, hi everybody. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to take a look at some more viewer questions, and of course, hopefully some good answers to those viewer questions. So there aren't that many since the last time, since I only did the last one a couple of weeks ago, but they're all fairly involved. So hopefully, what it makes up by way, or what it loses by way of spread, it'll make up for in depth. Okay, well, I think the most interesting question is one that doesn't involve openings. I'm going to save that for last. So those of you who are real opening fans, I think you'll enjoy the first 3 bits, or the first 3 questions. At least I hope you will. And but then I think the last questions, which, as I said, weren't opening related, are perhaps the most interesting. Okay, certainly I think the most valuable to the general audience. All right, so the first one is from King Hunter, and he's asking about a line at the closed Sicilian. And he's a hyper-accelerated dragon player, so that's e4, c5, knight f3, g6. And he finds the closed Sicilian very unpleasant, even depresses him, he says. So he says, or at least his understanding of this is that it's known to be nearly losing from move 2. So the closed Sicilian is this, and he asks, but why? And okay, so he gives the following line as what he plays against it. So g6, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6. I guess we can flip this around here. f4, rook to b8, a4, knight f6, knight f3, castles, castles, h3, a6, h3, b5, takes, takes, bishop e3, b4, knight e2, knight d7. So he had a couple of notation errors, but I'm pretty sure this is the position that he had in mind. And so he says, okay, at the end of this line, white can either play rook to b1, or instead of that, some pawn advance like c3 and d4. So he asks, well, how does black win? He sees that black is better, but what are the strategies here? And okay, are there maybe some other approaches against the closed Sicilian? Okay, well, it's a lot of stuff to address there, and the first thing I would say is that whoever told you that black is winning or close to winning in the closed Sicilian has sold you a bill of goods. The closed Sicilian is perfectly playable. There are quite a lot of people who use it and have used it over the years. Vasily Smyslov, the former world champion, was a big fan of it in the 50s. Nigel Short plays it still quite regularly, and there are many other people who use it. So it's far from... Spassky used it to tremendous effect in the 60s, and in particular basically crushed Geller, won his candidates matches with Geller, or one of them, in 68 using this opening. So it's not at all some kind of trivial weapon that black can just defeat outright. So I'm not sure, again, why you got that impression, if it was some club player who misinformed you, or maybe misunderstanding some grandmaster source, but no, not at all. The closed Sicilian is, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the most testing line. I think probably black has an easier time equalizing against it than he does against, let's say, mainline open Sicilians. But no, it's perfectly playable, 100%. All right, so let me offer a few comments about this whole variation, starting from knight to c3. All right, so first of all, instead of g6 here, the usual move order would be knight to c6, and then after g3, g6. Okay, it's not a big deal, but that's the usual. But since you're really committed to an accelerated dragon, if you can, then I would say g6 is a reasonable move order for you to choose. Okay. Another system, though, that's very good, I think, against the closed Sicilian is to play 2e6 with the idea of d5. The only drawback is that if your opponent plays knight to f3 here, well, in that case, you're stuck. So d5 isn't as good against this. And if you go into a normal Sicilian, well, you're not getting your dragon anymore. So I think e6 is pretty good, but it does restrict your options, and it's not really for you if you're a dragon player. So, okay, g6, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop g7. I should mention one other thing, which is that there's also the Grand Prix attack that you have to be concerned about as well. So with f4. So this is still another system, and this is also very, very popular. And I'm not going to say anything about it. Again, it's a huge system. Roman Djindjikhashvili has promoted it over the years. Gowan Jones, the young British Grandmaster, has been playing this with very good results, and in fact just put out a book on it in the past year. I think it's a starting out book from Everyman Press. But that's, I think, considered really a different family of variations than the closed Sicilian, so we won't really address that. But you have to know it too. Okay, so g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, f4. Okay, and then here your line was with rook to b8, which is okay, but perhaps e6 might be the most flexible approach. At one point of this is that black wants to try to plug up white on the king side. So knight f3, knight g to e7, castles, castles, bishop to e3. And now white wants to play d4. So there are two strategies here. The old-fashioned strategy is to just plug it up here with knight to d4 and not allow him to play it. And then, okay, the main line here goes like this: e5, and black can win a pawn here by taking on f3 and taking twice on e5. But well, actually, it doesn't really win a pawn because c5 hangs, and white also makes very good use of the e4 square. So main line here is knight to f5, bishop f2, takes. Knight number 2 comes into d4, black goes back, takes, and now knight e4, and white gets good compensation. So I'm not sure what theory's current evaluation of this position is, but it's an important one, and black has a number of approaches. I think the main approach is with f5, knight c5, and then here queen to c7 or queen to d6 have been played. And an interesting move might merit some consideration is f4. In a way, it's a little bit ugly because it's giving up the e4 square and loosening up the light squares in general, but on the other hand, it's just a very direct and forceful approach, one that says that black is quite interested in going for play of his own. So that's worth considering. Instead of f5, another approach is knight f5, offering to return the pawn. White doesn't usually take it because if bishop c5, then bishop to d4 check is in fact winning the exchange. So c3, c4, and now here white doesn't play d4 but plays d takes c4, queen c7, and this is again just a very interesting position, one that merits further consideration, further examination. Okay, so that's one approach, right? After bishop to e3. The second approach, which I think is more popular nowadays, at least recently, is to play b6, allowing d4, and then either to play bishop to a6 first, or just playing d5. So the point of b6 is that you're holding the c5 pawn somewhat, and this is a very feisty, counterattacking way to handle the position, and I kind of like it. So I've played this before with black myself. Not in a tournament game, but against a friend who's a specialist in this and did okay. So again, you need to do some further research on this, but this is, I think, a way that I would prefer to play to the quick rook to b8 that you utilized. Okay, so here you played rook to b8. Now white played a4, but a4 is a bit double-edged. I mean, it opens the a file, but it's not clear that that's really to white's advantage. Black in general is going to have the queenside play, so it's not really. It may not be the greatest of ideas for white to open up a line there. Even if it slows black down momentarily, in the long run, white may be able to, or white may have some problems dealing with black's extra space over on the queenside. So instead of a4, knight f3 is sometimes played. I think actually usually played. Okay, so b5, castles, b4. And now white sometimes plays knight to d5 and then brings the knight back to e3 when it's kicked. So like this, and then knight e7. So knight e2 is more common, and now black can play e6, and then knight to e7, although white gets f5 in fairly quickly here. So something that I should mention here, and explicitly mention, is that the question of what to do with this knight on g8 is a very important issue in the closed Sicilian. So, okay, knight on f6, it's obviously better centralized, and from that standpoint, it's a good thing. But it blocks the bishop on g7, and it also blocks your f-pawn. So there are quite a number of closed Sicilian variations where black plays e6, knight g to e7, and then sometimes plays f5, preventing white from making his thematic f5 advance. So that's a really important option for black, or a fundamental choice for black, that you need to be aware of and may wish to do some research on your own. All right. So let's go back to your line with a4. Okay, and so here again, knight f6. And this seems to me again like a rush, so I would rather play either e6 and then knight to e7. So again, a different approach, castles, castles. And white sometimes plays king to h1, or again, bishop to e3. And bishop to e3, once again, is typically met with knight to d4. And black, again, will have the option of playing f5 to stymie white's approach with g4 and f5. Okay, so that's one approach. And also sometimes white plays, as I said, king to h1. Among other points, there's the possibility of dropping the bishop back to g1 in some cases, and it just avoids any problems on the diagonal. So, just another move. Okay, so this e6, knight e7 line is one way to go. Another way to play is to just get on with your queenside counterattack as fast as possible. So knight f3, b5, takes, castles, b4. And, and so on. White can play knight to d5 or knight to e2. Ideas that we've already seen. Alright, so you play knight f6. So it's committal, and it blocks the diagonal, but it puts the knight on a better square. A more aggressive square. I won't necessarily say a better square, because pieces shouldn't be evaluated on their own. They have to be evaluated in terms of the whole position. So just because the knight is happier in some abstract sense on f6, doesn't mean that it's a better square for you as the player using the black pieces. I mean, it's getting in the way of the bishop on g7, which means that well, that's significant because two reasons. One is that the knight often goes to d4, and so you want to have control on that square. And the other is that, again, black's play with a6, b5, b4 is in large part about extending this diagonal. Now, in the game, you drop the knight back. Well, I shouldn't say in the game. At the end of the line, you drop the knight back to d7. Okay, that's one way of reopening the diagonal. But see, then you have to ask the question, well, is the knight really better off on d7 than on e7? Plus, you're spending an extra move to get it there. So it's at least you will be if you play e6 at some point. So it's an interesting question. One advantage of playing this knight f6 d7 approach without e6 is that you keep better control over the f6 square. So if you've played e6, white plays f5 and keeps pushing, if you look up some of these variations, you'll see that white sometimes rams a pawn all the way up to f6. Well, it's a lot easier to do that when black's pawn is on e6. When black's pawn is on e7, not so easy. Okay, so continuing here. Knight f3, castles, castles, a6, h3, b5, takes. Actually, one more thing I want to point out. Sometimes it's not such a bad idea. I don't know if it's... here. Okay, I don't really know about this particular variation, or this sub-variation I should say, but it's also worth considering for black to play the move bishop to g4 in this type of position, because so much of black's play really revolves around these dark squares. So d4, the h8 to a1 diagonal, and so on. And this bishop the slight squared bishop for black really doesn't have a big role to play. So it's not such a bad idea to swap it off sometimes. You are giving up the two bishops, and at some point that could come back to haunt you. I mean, that's a possibility, but that's many moves down the road. And also, because this bishop has no really great squares on its own, it's not bad to get it out of the way, too. So you're getting rid of a piece that doesn't really fit, that doesn't have a really comfortable place, and you're getting better control over some of the dark squares that you're interested in anyway. So takes, and now knight to d7, and and so on. Bishop b3, a6. And notice here it's also a lot harder for white to get in d4. So, okay, typical position. Maybe white plays rook to b1, b4, and so on. All right, so anyway, the game goes on, and that's just another way to handle it. All right, so going back. So a6 instead of bishop to g4, h3, b5, takes. Okay, and then here your line was with bishop to e3. Now it's more common for whites to play g4. Again, expanding, preparing f5 and or g5. So b4, knight e2. Another point to g4 is that it slots the g3 square for the knight. So bishop to b7, preparing rook to a8. Excuse me, bishop to e3, rook a8, and so on. And again, this is just for further exploration on your part. But again, typical ideas. Black is going to try to make progress on the queen side. White is going to try to stall black as long as possible and get on with his king side play. Okay, so bishop to e3 is what you sent. b4, knight e2, and here, okay, knight to d7. But the most common move actually is bishop to b7. Again, with the idea of challenging white's rook with rook to a8 as quickly as possible. Okay, now here, b3, rook a8, and now two moves have been played here. In both cases, quitting the file. So rook to b1 was played in a game between Tiller and Ems. Tiller is not a bad player, but Ems is significantly better, and Ems won in typical fashion. So this will, I hope, be instructive. So we'll go through it fairly quickly, though. All right, so you can see, of course, both players are getting on with their plans. Okay, so white kicks this rook back, but on the other hand, he's disconnecting his own rooks, and the knight's further away from the king side. So it's not really clear who's benefiting. And white is pushing all these pawns, but at some point he has to actually do something. And he perhaps waits a little too long to actually make something happen. So h5, knight f6. And now this pawn on g4 is kind of clumsy. In fact, white's whole king side looks a bit overextended now. So he plays h6, bishop h8. And h6 may even be doing black a favor too, because, well, now the h-file stays closed, and black's pawn on g6 is quite secure. Okay, bishop to h3, protecting the pawn. Takes, d5. And now white's just in big trouble because his center is collapsing. The problem is if he plays e5, then d4, and you can just see, I mean, it's a mess. The rook is hanging, the bishop is hanging, and in some cases, black might even consider not taking the rook, or maybe the rook will just run away, and there's the possibility of a big rotor-rooter job with the queen and bishop on the diagonal. So white's in trouble. So he took, knight takes, and now white just has a dreadful position. Black has complete control over both long diagonals. White has no attack at all, and Ems was able to win in another 11 moves. Okay, so let's go back. All right, so rook to c1 has been played in a couple of other games. One between Boog and Van Wely. So both games continue rook a2, g4, and now Van Wely played queen a5, rook to a8, f5. So white's play looks a little bit more purposeful in this game too, and it just ends in a slugfest here. So white is going in the right direction here, and now rook to a1. So Van Wely is very eager to exchange off all the rooks because white wants to keep these rooks to have things like rook takes f6 sacrifices and queen h7 and so on, trying to break through here. So in fact, let me come back to this game. Okay, so g4, Van Wely played queen to a5 in an earlier game between Spassky and Giller, very famous game. Giller played queen to a8, not quite as strong. In fact, it's hard to really understand why he went there instead of a5. After you'll see with this next move. So queen to e1, queen a6. Okay, queen f2 for Spassky, knight a7. So he's going to go into b5 and then c3, and trying to take over again the dark squares. So f5, knight b5, fg, hg, knight to g5, and now actually a different idea. So he plays knight to a3, trying to pressure the c pawn further. But now white just goes over to the attack. So queen h4, the threats to play rook takes f6, and queen h7 mate. Alright, so black plays rook to c8, giving his king luft. Rook takes f6 anyway, and now if bishop takes, then queen check, and mate here. So of course black avoids that with e takes f6, but now check here, and knight takes f7. This is killing. On king takes f7, then bishop to h6, and knight f4, and just everything comes at black, and he's gonna perish here. So black just tries to ignore the rook, or sorry, ignore the knight with rook to take c2. Spassky just keeps on coming. Bishop to h6. Okay, swaps off the rooks. King f7, it's nothing better. g5, f5, and he takes this. And now even the bishop is into the act here. And the problem for black is that, well, now white can just swap everything off and win with those passers. So black resigned here. All right, so that's a famous game and a delight from white's point of view. So let's see what Van Wely did and how this kind of differed. So queen e1, rook a8, f5, queen a3. So first of all, he saved a tempo for his counterattack. Okay, so here comes white. And we've seen the importance of swapping off all these rooks here before the damage is too severe. Okay, d4. So he's trying to block off this long diagonal. C takes d4, e5. Okay, so really kind of throwing the kitchen sink at black. So d takes e5, rook f6, ef6, check here, knight f7. Okay, so here the idea is a little bit different, but it's that if king takes f7, then bishop to d5 check is just crushing. So black has to add something else. Fortunately for him, he does. So d takes e3, knight h6, so hoping to play queen g8 check and start collecting things. Okay, rook c1 again. Now if knight c1, queen c1, so he just gets out of the way here. And now the problem for white is this move knight to e7. I mean, black is up 2 rooks and a pawn here, so he can certainly afford to be a little bit generous. And with the knight on e7, g8 is covered, and g6 is covered, and white's just toast here. So it's a mopping up operation from here. So bishop takes b7, so he gets a piece back. Rook c2, and okay, this is just catastrophic. Taking the rook is pointless. Rook takes e2 check is going to lead to a quick mate. So he plays bishop to d5, hoping to, well, it's not even clear. He's not even threatening anything. Of course, if knight takes d5, then queen g8 check is, white's back in business, but of course he just ignores it, plays rook takes e2 check, and white resigned. So, okay, so that was after knight to e2. Instead of knight to d7, playing bishop to b7 with the idea of challenging on the a file. All right, instead, knight to d7 kind of goes its own way, and here white has a variety of moves. Okay, so there's queen c1, and there's rook to b1. But again, fundamentally, this is going to be very, very similar. All right, so again, black is going to jump on the a file. He's going to try to use the long diagonal, and white is going to try to expand on the king side and go for a counterattack. So there are 3 games that I'll just suggest that you look up. One is McShane against Volokeiten. That was played in Germany in 2006. That was a game with queen to c1, actually, and Volokeiten won that game. With rook to b1, 2 games to mention. So one is a game between Rodrigues Villa against Gilberto Milos, the Brazilian grandmaster. Milos, M-I-L-O-S, but I think I've heard it pronounced Milos. And then the other game is Fedorov against Gelashvili from Dubai in 2002, and that game white won. So all 3 results are represented in the games that I mentioned: McShane, Volokeiten, Rodrigues Villa against Milos, and Fedorov against Gelashvili. So what can I say? I mean, there are a lot of games in this line. it's far from being a win or nearly a win for black. I mean, it's, as I said, perfectly playable. It'll often come down to finesses and tactical calculations. And, what can I say? It's kind of a good luck with that sort of scenario. But I hope I've at least given you a variety of options and some understanding of some basic ideas and some general both plans and developmental schemes. So the rest is going to be up to you. Good luck. Okay, on to the next question. This is from King Hunter. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is from Nimzo BG. The previous question was from King Hunter. So Nimzo BG asks about the following French line, and he's white in it, so we'll switch the colors. So it goes like this: e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, knight f6. And then here, instead of the usual e5, he suggests bishop to d3. And now here, okay, the move that he wants to look at is d takes e4, but I should point out that after c5, white really has nothing better than going back into the regular main lines with e5, knight f to d7, c3, knight c6, and so on. Okay, but d takes e4 is also okay. Goes into a different kind of line. Knight takes e4. Now, here, yeah, I mean, okay. I mean, there are a number of moves that are played here. Of course, you can't take the pawn. Hopefully everyone sees that in a millisecond, because this just wins on the spot. But black has a number of ways to play. But okay, the move that Nimzo BG gives is the main move, knight b to d7. Okay, bishop to g5, bishop e7. And now here, his move is knight f3, which is pretty rare. It's more common for white to take on f6, either with the knight or with the bishop. Okay, and I think queen to e2 is also a move, but whatever, doesn't really matter. Here, knight f3, knight takes e4, bishop takes, queen takes. Okay, he doesn't mention knight takes f2, but it's worth taking a moment and figuring this thing out as well. So if king takes f2, queen e7, black is probably pretty happy, but with the pawn sack, bishop takes d8, knight takes d1, bishop c7, knight b2, and then bishop to e2, white seems to be slightly better. He is down a pawn, but he's got more space. Black is going to have to spend some moves getting his knight from b2 back to a reasonable location. And it's not even clear what the reasonable location will be, because if he goes back to b6, white plays c4, and then the knight is again kind of dominated. So between that and white's bishop pair, he should have an edge here. Okay, so after knight e4, bishop e7, queen e7 is right, bishop takes e4. Okay, and now his line continues with queen to b4 check, but I think it's more accurate for black to play knight f6 straight away. And then on bishop to d3, queen to b4 check, queen to d2. Queen takes b2 will transpose to what he wants us to look at. But I think here, queen takes d2 check is perfectly fine. So king takes d2, b6, knight e5, bishop to b7, and the position is pretty close to equal. I mean, white has a very, very small pull, but it's quite fragile, and black can equalize most of the time pretty quickly and easily. So, for instance, if bishop checks, king here, and bishop to c6, trying to at least get some good control over the c6 square, knight to e4 check looks like a satisfactory solution. So king e3, knight to d6, takes and takes, and the position is basically equal here. So I think knight f6 here is the best. The difference is that after queen to b4 check, queen d2, now if queen takes d2, white can play knight takes d2, and after knight f6 play bishop to f3. So I think this is a positive difference for white. So this bishop is on a very good diagonal. If black wants to play, well, if he wants to develop his bishop, he's either going to have to play rook to b8, which is a little bit slow and awkward. It's not that awkward, but it's just that it wastes a tempo, and the rook's going to have to move yet again. So it's like black is giving up a couple of tempi there. If he plays c6 to protect the b pawn, well, then the bishop is really kind of stuck in place, and that's not attractive. So white has a comfortable advantage here. So queen to d2. Through this move order, black pretty much has to play queen takes b2. Okay, so now castles, and his question is essentially, does white have chances here? And his basic idea is to use the queen, bishop, and knight for a kingside attack when black eventually castles, and also to gain some time maybe with rook to b1 and rook to b3, hitting the queen and also preparing in some cases a rook lift. Well, I think white does have reasonable chances here, so I think this is entirely playable. Maybe this whole line overall isn't the most testing approach, perhaps because of knight to f6 instead of queen to b4 check, as I mentioned before. And also black can play c5 and go to the main line, but this isn't bad. I mean, I think white always has some chances for an edge in pretty much every line that we've looked at, including the knight f6 line. So let's just take a quick look at how the game might go from here. So knight f6, bishop to d3, castles, rook f to b1, queen a3, say knight to e5, b6. And so I looked at a few moves here, and I think black is actually in pretty decent shape, but white has chances. And I would just say, give this a try in the context of some blitz games and maybe a training game. Try it out. I mean, nothing to lose but the game. So anyway, some possibilities here. All right, so one is, let's say, the direct rook to b3. Here I think after queen d6, say queen to f4, bishop to b7, I think black is okay. I mean, white has compensation for the pawn, but I don't think black really has anything to feel too bad about either. So he's going to be able to pressure this pawn and also maybe achieve c5 fairly easily as well. And even in some cases maybe play the move queen to d5, which could be rather annoying because white usually has to do something that he doesn't want to in order to meet the threat of queen takes g2 mate. So if he plays bishop to f1, well, that avoids making any weaknesses and it clears the third rank for the rook to come to h3 or g3, so one of these two squares. But then the bishop is passive on f1. If he plays instead, so let's do this again. If he plays f3, well, that closes the diagonal altogether, but then it blocks the rook on b3 from getting to g3 or h3. If you play queen g3, well, again, you're kind of over. What do I want to say? Basically, the queen is doing the job that the rook should do. So now, again, the rook on b3 is underemployed as a result. So, okay. So bishop to b7, and I think black has, or I should say, white maybe doesn't have full compensation for the pawn, but he still has some. Okay, so that was rook to b3. A really wild approach is g4. And sometimes this can be very, very good. You want to kick this great defensive knight away from f6 and get on with your attack. But it's weakening too. So bishop to b7, g5, and now knight h5, followed if necessary by g6 at some point. And white could be rather Swiss cheesy over there. I mean, if he tried something like bishop to e2, hoping to immediately put the question to the knight, well, black's queen all of a sudden jumps back into the game here, and queen g2 mate is, of course, a real threat. So this is not quite so easy for white either. So perhaps the best move is rook to b4, as funny as that looks, trying to kind of cage the black queen here. So you can see that knight to c4, for instance, is a real threat. The only move would be queen to a6, and then knight takes b6 would be winning. So black should play knight to d5 here. And now rook to b3, queen d6, say c4, knight f6, queen f4, c5, and this I think is just a very interesting position. Both sides are getting things that they want. I mean, white has almost completed his development. He has a nice central position and at least some vague threats in the direction of black's king. Black, for his part, is getting close to finishing development, and all of his pieces are going to end up on pretty good squares. And, of course, he's a pawn up, so that certainly helps too. So it's an interesting possibility, I would say, to try it out, and good luck with it. Okay, next question is one that's too broad, and here let me reiterate that questions that involve discussing kind of wholesale variations that entire books are written about is really not very useful, both because it's too broad for me to say something worthwhile about, or it's hard for me to say something worthwhile about it, on those really broad parameters, and it just takes too big of a bite into what we can do here with this kind of program. So even the first question from King Hunter was really too broad, but it might be worth discussing every once in a while a system like that. But this is just really too big. So the question I'm complaining about a little bit here is from Chess Enthusiast, and he asks, basically compare and contrast the English attack in the Najdorf versus the English attack in the Paulsen/Taimanov, and then to give some plans. Well, okay, I mean, the English attack in the Najdorf in particular, and then there's both the E5 and E6 versions. The E5 version really isn't an English attack proper, but it's generally referred to in that way. I would say a better name is the Byrne attack, Byrne, for the American Grandmaster Robert Byrne. But anyway, so there's just huge books written on this, and there's usually a new book every couple of years on this English attack system. Not to mention tons of new games and theoretical articles. I mean, it's a huge system, and there are a lot of different plans for both sides. So it's really very unmanageable. And then correspondingly, I mean, the English attack in the Taimanov is also a huge system, and extremely popular in the last few years. So all I'll do here is just basically show what these systems are, and at the most superficial level discuss some of the dissimilarities. Okay, so E4, C5, Knight F3. Okay, and now in the Najdorf, D6, D4, takes, here. Okay, this is in Najdorf. Bishop E3, sometimes F3. The point of F3 is to avoid bishop to E3, knight to G4 lines. The drawback of playing F3, if you want to call it a drawback, is that now black can be annoying if he wants with queen to B6. So you still can't play bishop to E3 because then the B2 pawn hangs. So, okay, it just goes off in a different direction. All right. But generally, well, knight G4 it's important, but I mean, it's its own system. And if nothing else, in addition to bishop to G5, which is perfectly good, white could play bishop to C1. And when black plays knight to F6, as he usually will, white can then try F3 and see where it goes from there. All right, but let's stick to the topic here. Okay, so there's E5, which, as I said, this system is better called the Byrne attack. And then, okay, knight B3, bishop E6. Okay, if F3, this is considered, I think, a less accurate move order nowadays. Bishop E7, queen D2, castles, knight B to D7, G4. And this basic formation for white is the English attack. So queen D2, well, bishop E3, queen D2, castle long, F3, G4. And the sort of the fantasy is to just play G4 or G5, H4, G6, H5, maybe in the other move order sometimes, and just crack open the lines over there, kill the black king, celebrate, and show all your friends the game. All right, but it's not so easy. Okay, so B5, G5, B4. Okay, now let's say GF takes, queen takes, knight F6. And in this position, black is doing quite well. So white's attack is fairly slow. Black has a lot of open lines on the queen side. And I think black has a positive score from this position. So going back to this position, more accurate now is considered queen to D2. Knight B to D7, F3, bishop E7, now G4. Castles, B5, G5, B4, knight E2, knight E8. Okay, by the way, there are a lot of lines where black used to play knight to B6 really quickly, so the second knight, when it's kicked from G5, can go back to D7. But there are other issues that come up. And there are also some lines where black plays knight to H5. This isn't one of them. There are also lines where black plays H5 before white plays G4. And there are lines where white doesn't castle queenside, but waits for B5 and then plays A4 and tries to show that black's queenside is overextended. So just a huge number of alternative possibilities. But this is kind of a typical variation, and one that was extremely popular at top level a year or two ago. I think it still gets played, but it's it's no longer really topical in the Super GM events. Okay, but it goes like this: F4, A5, F5, A4, Knight B to D4. So not allowing black to open up the queenside lines. ED, Knight to D4. And now black doesn't play bishop takes B2 because of Knight to C6. So just to show you. Okay, so in this, then I believe Knight C6 is the main reason why people don't play this. Then this falls. Okay, so here black plays B3, king to B1, so can't allow BA and then queening. B takes C2 check, Knight C2, and now sometimes bishop takes A2 check is played, but the main move is bishop to B3, takes, Knight A3, and there have been about 50 games played since 2005 in this variation. Unbelievably complicated. Maybe it's been worked out to a forced draw by now. I haven't followed the theory in about a year in this variation, but obviously ridiculously complicated. White's going for the kingside play, which is standard. Black is going to go for queenside play. There are some very interesting games played by Karyakin in this line, one against Anand. So again, happy research. Very, very sharp. Every tempo is crucial, and it's you get into these race situations that are unbelievably sharp. Okay, so that's the burn attack version. Then there's the English attack version or the Neidorff version with E6. Though actually this is the English attack proper. Really, we could call this a Scheveningen approach as opposed to a Neidorff approach. Okay, white plays the same way. F3, Queen D2, can play G4 also. Black can play Knight B to D7 or Bishop to B7 here. G4. Sometimes Knight to B6 is played here, but okay, H6. Castles, Bishop B7, H4. So white flings the kingside pawns, black flings the queenside pawns, and then a line that was unbelievably popular in the early 2000s, and even just a little bit before that, goes like this. So white's won a pawn, but his queenside is really airy, and this is just, again, insanely sharp. Tons of games have been played in this variation, probably at least 100. And again, it's you got to know a huge amount of theory. You have to be a very good player, both at attack and at defense, and in being aware of your opponent's threats. So, can certainly play it, but it's razor edge chess. Okay, so now we go to the Taimanov, or Paulson, but really it's the Taimanov. And this is quite different. Okay, so what are the differences here? Well, okay, so let's say F3. So, first of all, black is much more concerned with development, very direct development, than he is in the Neidorff. So if you compare that to, let's say, a position like this, okay, you can see that white's got 5 pieces out into the game, he's castled. Black only has 2 pieces out, and he's far from castling. Alright, so back to this position. Okay, so here, black has as much development, pretty much, as white does. Maybe he's half a tempo behind in development, because his bishop from F1 can come out quickly, while black's can't. But by and large, black is behaving in a much more concerned fashion. The pawn structure is quite different. So with this black not having committed his d-pawn yet, there are quite a few lines where he plays d5, and that changes the central configuration considerably. Black is also very ready to operate on the c file, while white's attack really doesn't exist yet on the king side. Well, okay, so what does white have going for him? Well, the answer here is that white, because of black's pawn structure, will often have very good play on the dark squares, and especially if he's able to exchange off black's dark squared bishop. Alright, well here black has a very wide array of choices. So there's knight to a5, which was an Anand specialty for a few years. There's knight to e7, so again clearing the file there to put pressure on the knight on c3. There's the immediate d5, and then there's also b5, preparing bishop to b7, rook c8, and so on. Again, delaying castling, going for queenside play and grabbing some space over there. And then there's what I would consider to be the main move nowadays, which is knight to e5. Now, here white typically doesn't play like a standard English attack with g4. So he doesn't go on this headhunting approach, but instead typically plays knight to b3, which looks a bit funny, just allowing black to double these pawns on the c file. But theory pretty much doesn't worry too much about this. So bishop c3, queen c3, takes and takes. It's going to take black quite a while to even begin to bother this pawn on c3. And meanwhile, white's bishop pair, and especially this really powerful bishop, dark square bishop, are going to provide him with more than enough compensation. I mean, you can see this bishop coming to a square like c5, maybe to d6, or to b6, and just really locking black in pretty effectively. So after knight to b3, b5 is more common. And now white again has a few ways to continue. So one is just to play king to b1, simple prophylactic move, and not even worrying again about this exchange. Another move is bishop to d4, which does take an eye on it, but also prepares, in some cases, to play some kind of kingside advance. Also, queen to e3 could be a possible follow-up, or queen to f2, again trying to exert pressure on some of the dark squares. And then queen to e1, I think, is the main line. And then there's a suggestion by Alexander Holifman of queen to d4, with the idea of knight c6, queen b6, just swapping off the queens, and again going for this dark square control. So a variety of ways to play, but you can see that the general tenor of the play is considerably different from what it is in the Najdorf English attack. So it's very rarely about these races, at least in this knight to e5 line. White is concerned more with these dark squares in the center and on the queen side, maybe grabbing the bishop pair, and black is much more developmentally oriented in this variation, and kind of hesitant to castle. Okay, well, so that's all I wanted to say about these opening variations. Again, I prefer if you guys keep the opening questions more limited, rather than asking about entire systems like the closed Sicilian, or especially compare the English attack in the Najdorf and in the Taimanov, which are two humongous opening variations or systems. All right, so let me turn finally to this question from Jay Wiss, which I think is quite interesting, or actually a pair of questions. All right, so the first one is this. During long games, he asked me how I divide up my thinking time, and do I allow myself a few minutes here and there to let my mind wander? How do you keep yourself calm and relaxed? Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I would say unless you're a Buddhist monk or something like that, or you just have tremendous intellectual stamina, it's almost impossible to not have your mind wander at some point. So what I would suggest is that you let most of the wandering go on when it's your opponent's move. So, there are people who like to stay at the board the whole time, and there are people who practically get up like their pants are on fire after every move. I'm closer to the latter, but it depends on what's going on in the position. But I would say when it's your opponent's move, I mean, it's not that you should just spend no time thinking about the position at all and always get up, but that's a good time to let your mind relax a little bit, walk a little, get some water, go to the bathroom, whatever, and just kind of work the tension out of your body, clear your mind a little bit. So again, don't do it so often that you kind of lose your intensity, you lose your focus on the game. But a bit of that, certainly to clear your mind, so that way you can really, again, break the tension and have enough energy to work hard when it is your move, I think is not a bad thing. So you can think about some general things when it's not your move, assuming it's not a really crazy tactical position or you're in time pressure or something. But, just to generally reflect on it, maybe consider one important line from your opponent when it's his or her move, but as a rule, take it a little bit easier at that point. Okay, and I think that both helps as an energy-saving device and to help maintain calm. Okay, the other question he asks is one that's probably more personal to him, but I think there are probably more people who deal with some version of this than we might expect. So he says that he plays better against opponents after the first time because he's more nervous with strangers. So, how do you handle this? Well, I would say that you should just, skip the first game against all of your opponents and just go straight to the second game. All right, of course that's we're entirely tongue-in-cheek. So what would I really do? Well, I think I don't really have that problem per se, but I mean, I do experience nervousness in certain contexts. So what I would say is, okay, well, let me continue. So he says, this is hard for him because he has social anxiety disorder and feels this urge to leave the room when he goes to new places, especially if they're crowded. And I know people who have suffered from that as well. And there have been times, too, where I've felt a little uncomfortable being around people that I don't know, especially in a crowd situation. So what I would say is to do maybe one of two things. So, and you'll know which works better for you. So one would be just to hang around in the crowd for long enough before the game that you kind of work the nerves out. If that doesn't work, if that doesn't help you at all, then I would say kind of go the opposite way and wait until everyone is kind of settled down in the tournament hall, and show up a minute or two or three late, so that way it's quiet. You don't have that kind of crowd noise, that energy of everyone milling around, and maybe handle it in that way. And as far as what do you do with strangers? Well, again, can maybe take a couple of different approaches to that. One would be to engage in some kind of relaxation exercise before or maybe during the game early on, just to kind of calm yourself, whether it's some kind of breathing exercise or imagining some kind of situation where you feel calm. There are a number of it's a pretty commonly discussed topic, not necessarily in chess literature, but general relaxation. And if you've seen some kind of counselor about the problem, I'm sure that person is probably giving you some suggestions along those lines. So that might be one thing. The second thing, kind of again on the opposite end of the spectrum, would be to show up early and chat enough with your opponent, if the person is amenable to it, to so you get past viewing the person as at least a complete stranger. So I don't know. I mean, again, try various things, see what works. Again, if you've talked to a counselor and you have an ongoing relationship with one, certainly ask that person, and maybe you should post that answer to the forum here. It might help other people as well. So I don't know if it helps. I'm just kind of conjecturing. Again, I have some indirect experience of it, or experience of some similar things, and know some people like that. But I'm again kind of speculating here. So I hope that helps. If it does, it'd be great if you'd let me know. All right, so let's call this a show here. It's been kind of long, and hopefully everyone is still awake. And again, I hope it helps, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.